The UAE falls back into the firing line as the U.S. and Iran clash over the Strait of Hormuz. Seen by Iran as a proxy for the U.S. and Israel, Tehran targets the Emirates' largest oil storage facilities. As Abu Dhabi appears to forge its own path in the Arab world and the Gulf, will its choices to side with the U.S. and Israel prove a strength or liability? I'm Andrea Sankey, and this is the Newsmakers. Last week, the United Arab Emirates made the shock announcement that it was leaving OPEC. Well, it was a shock to some, but to others, it was obvious for a long time that Abu Dhabi would seek to maximize its position as a major oil and gas producer. Still, its departure has highlighted another rift in the Gulf, particularly with Saudi Arabia. Here's a look now at why the UAE's strategy is as much based on politics as economics.
Tensions in the Gulf are rising, with the US-Iran ceasefire hanging by a thread. On Monday, an Iranian drone attack caused a fire at the United Arab Emirates' critical Fujairah oil facility. Emirati authorities said their air defenses intercepted 19 missiles and drones coming from Iran. The escalation comes a week after the UAE announced its decision to leave OPEC and OPEC+, a grouping of the world's major oil-producing countries. The organization's third largest producer has long been at odds with the cartel's production quotas, aiming to regulate the market.
We're dealing with many of the world-class industrial countries that are dependent on us, and we owe it to those partners who elected to invest in the UAE to produce what the world requires without restrictions.
The UAE has heavily invested to increase its production capacity to 5 million barrels per day by 2027. But under OPEC quotas, it's only allowed to produce 3.6 million barrels. With the blockades in the Strait of Hormuz remaining in place, the short-term impact of that decision will be limited. But in the long run, it could give the UAE a strategic edge, reduce oil prices, and diminish the power of OPEC and its de facto leader, Saudi Arabia.
And I think it comes when Saudi Emirati ties are really strained. We've seen competition between the two playing out in Sudan. We've seen it in Somaliland. We've seen it in Yemen.
The US-Israeli war on Iran has put that rivalry in the spotlight. More than half of Iran's attacks on Gulf countries have been aimed at the UAE.
Unfortunately, the Gulf Cooperation Council stance was the weakest historically, considering the nature of the attack and the threat it posed to everyone. The stance was the weakest historically.
While the UAE's distance from its Gulf partners is growing, its ties with the US and Israel are deepening. The UAE was the first country to sign US President Donald Trump's Abraham Accords to normalize relations with Israel in 2020. Tel Aviv has deployed its Iron Dome defense system to the UAE to help it intercept Iranian missiles. And Trump, who has repeatedly blamed OPEC policies for high oil prices, welcomed the UAE's exit. Meanwhile, Iran has accused the UAE of undermining regional security and solidarity.
That a country would act in a negative or retaliatory manner toward the region or toward OPEC member states is by no means constructive.
Some believe the UAE's departure will strengthen cohesion within OPEC, while others think it will put the cartel's survival to a real test. Saudi Arabia is the world's largest oil exporter and still holds strong leverage over the markets. And the kingdom remains a strong regional partner for Washington, but so far it's refused to join the Abraham Accords. So in the wake of the war, Riyadh and Abu Dhabi have become crucial actors in reshaping regional dynamics, both economically and politically.
Well, joining me now to look further at intra-Gulf relations are, from Jeddah, political analyst Khaled Almaeena; from Dubai, author of The Myth of the Oil Crisis and non-resident fellow at the Arab Gulf States Institute, Robin Mills; and from Washington, CEO of Gulf State Analytics and adjunct assistant professor at Georgetown University, Giorgio Cafiero. Thanks all so much for being with me. Khaled, I'll start with you. First off, in your opinion, is the UAE's leaving OPEC more a political decision or an economic one?
I think it's a mixture of both. The analysis is that they wanted to have more leeway. They wanted to have a control of their own oil policy, and they chose flexibility over discipline, the collective discipline of OPEC. And they have already invested heavily in production capacity, and there are talks that they would like to increase and use it as a leverage in a framework that it lets it respond faster than if they are under the OPEC umbrella. So I think it's a mixture of both. But it did take people by surprise.
Indeed, it did. And I mean, do you think if the war had not broken out, they would have left at this time?
There are many ifs and buts. I don't know. I think the war expedited this about a rivalry, and they talk about what kind of jealousy between the OPEC states and all of it. I don't think so. But the war did not only change this OPEC decision. Mind you, the war has changed the Gulf forever.
Okay. I have to apologize to our viewers. I'm having a bit of trouble hearing Khaled. Let me turn to Robin, though, and ask if you think the UAE is only being prescient here in thinking that the days of, big oil and gas are numbered, so get what you can while these commodities still very much matter?
I think the UAE has had a view for several years now and been quite open about it, that it makes sense to develop and monetize oil and gas resources sooner rather than later. There's any imminent collapse in oil and gas demand is uncertain. And monetizing the oil now is a better choice than leaving it for a long, possibly long-dated and an uncertain future. There's also, I think, a view that OPEC has held strict production limits now since 2016, and those were not really intended to go on for 10 years. Obviously, then we ran into COVID, and that required further cuts. So there's been unexpected things along the way. But having these very deep production restrictions, has not been good for demand for oil. And also has encouraged competing supply from the Americas and elsewhere. So I think that there's a view, whatever you believe about long-term oil and gas demand, even in the medium term, that the restriction on production has been too deep.
But what does it mean then for the organization itself? Are its days really numbered in the end? And what does it also mean for, I'll put it as neighborly relations? And let's just be honest, the issue here is what's at play between Saudi and the UAE. Will this play up the rift that has been developing?
Well, as to the question of OPEC's continuing existence or relevance, the oil market has almost through its entire history had some kind of a body that was controlling or having some influence over supply. Otherwise, people have found the industry is incredibly volatile. I mean, prices are volatile anyway, but even more volatile without a steadying hand. And first of all, that was the international Western oil companies, and then it was the famous Texas Railroad Commission, and then from the early 1970s, it was OPEC. So there's I think always been a need for a body like this. Of course, who's in that body and who's out is another question, and how much influence it has. And of course, OPEC itself in 2016 brought in Russia and some other countries into the OPEC Plus alliance to have a bigger market share and therefore try to have more influence over the market. Okay, to your second question about OPEC, about the intra-OPEC politics.
Go ahead.
To your second question about the intra-OPEC politics and the difference between Saudi Arabia and the UAE. We know the two countries have various political differences over events in the region, both around the war in the Gulf and the politics in some neighbouring states like Yemen and so on. I don't really see the OPEC thing as a particularly big part of that. The UAE and Saudi Arabia have worked together on the whole constructively in OPEC for years. Yes, they had a significant difference of opinion over the production limits, but I think the UAE has made it clear, even going back a few years, that they were quite unhappy with the position of OPEC and with their position within it. And there are good market reasons for them to leave. Leaving now, of course, I think the timing is determined by the war, but the fact that they were ready to leave has been signalled now for at least 5 years.
Giorgio, then, and ask, what's your take on all of this? I mean, the reason I'm going back to the OPEC decision is because it seems to be kind of fundamental in defining particularly the UAE-Saudi relationship now.
Yeah, thank you so much. Really wonderful to be with you and the other guests. I think it's important to see this development within sort of a grander context whereby the UAE is increasingly determined to assert its autonomy and its independence. We know that the UAE is definitely not afraid to break with sort of traditional Arab norms on policy issues and to do what the leadership in Abu Dhabi believes serves the UAE's national interests. I definitely think as a consequence of Iran's aggression against the UAE, beginning with the American-Israeli war on Iran in late February, the leadership in Abu Dhabi felt, rightfully or not, they felt that the UAE did not receive enough support from the wider Arab Islamic world. And I think this sort of caused the UAE to be more willing to question the wisdom of staying in certain institutions that are really led by the Saudis if the UAE does not believe that membership in those institutions serves Emirati interests. Now, the UAE had been contemplating the idea of exiting OPEC for years prior to the outbreak of this war. So going back to one of your first questions, I don't think the war is necessarily the issue that triggered the UAE to leave, but I think it created conditions that made it a little bit easier for Abu Dhabi to actually take this step.
Okay. But in doing so, Giorgio, I mean, the UAE has arguably pitted itself pretty firmly in the U.S.-Israeli court among neighbors that don't firmly agree with what the U.S. and Israel does, especially in a partnership there. So do you think it's chosen the right side, so to speak?
Well, I think the UAE, like I said, is definitely trying to pursue what it sees as its own national interests. And the UAE is dealing with the new security landscape in the Gulf. And it seems to me that the leadership in Abu Dhabi believes that it's in the UAE's interests to double down on its partnerships with Israel and the United States. Moving beyond the issue of OPEC and energy policy, I think sort of the main issue really pitting the UAE against Saudi Arabia has to do with the UAE's alignment with Israel in support of sub-state or non-state actors that are seen as responsible for fragmenting Arab and African nation states, whether we're talking about Yemen, Somalia, Sudan, possibly Syria, whereas Saudi Arabia wants stability and believes that, well, both UAE and Saudi Arabia want stability, but they have different ideas of how stability can prevail. And the Saudi view is that nation states and the territorial integrity of nation states needs to be supported and respected. And this puts Saudi Arabia into more alignment with Egypt, Turkey, and Qatar. And I think this is the main division here. I don't think the question of who's in OPEC sits at the heart of this division. It's more about what some are calling the Emirati-Israeli axis of fragmentation in the Middle East and Africa.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. I wanted to explore the OPEC issue first because it is indicative of some other things happening. So let Khaled kind of dovetail off what you were just saying, Giorgio. I mean, from the Saudi perspective, is it wise then for the UAE to kind of double down on the partnerships that it has with the U.S. and Israel? Is it in the wider interest of the GCC and actually of the world itself?
Well, as far as Saudi Arabia is concerned, I mean, we looked with dismay at what's happening. You've already, I mean, that's what's happening in the Middle East, the attack on Gaza, the killing of people, the attack on Lebanon. So And we are totally against the Abrahamic Accords. What we also would like to let people know that Saudi Arabia has time and again said that there will be no relation with Israel until the implementation of 242 and 338 UN resolutions that have gathered dust and are almost covered with dust. So to bring the Israelis right into our laps in the Gulf states is something that's dangerous. And we are playing with fire. And I say it openly, there's absolutely, no way that countries in the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, or even in the Arab world, and I hate to use the word Middle East because it's a colonial expression, are going to, be happy with the Israelis moving around left, right, and center and coming around. So I think there will be a difference in that respect. There is no rivalry, and we are not playing the role of the big brother. And I say it openly because I hear it a lot. What is needed now is a concerted effort to see to it that the Middle East problem is described. That is to an end to hostilities. So we really are not in competition with the UAE. They are a sovereign state. They have their own needs, their own fears. But as far as Saudi Arabia is concerned, we are cautious about what's happening.
Yeah, cautious. I mean, playing with fire, I think, is an interesting way to put it, because, Khaled, you believe the UAE sees Saudi as a rival more than Saudi sees Abu Dhabi as an adversary in the region, correct? And that's dangerous.
But it's not a question of being dangerous. We are not entering a beauty pageant. We are not trying to come up in a competition. What we are seeing, Saudi Arabia, by virtue of its size, by its people, by having the two holy mosques in the Muslim world. And it has done a lot. And mind you, over the years, it has, as earlier it was said, striving to go ahead and see to it that the nation state survive. Now you have this Italian Somaliland, you have other things, you have the Israelis coming, and it is a matter of concern, and we are not playing with fire. In fact, Saudi Arabia is trying to douse the fire.
Okay, let me ask Robin then. I mean, is that easy for Saudi to say because it is the bigger player here? It is the bigger country? Because we have even heard kind of, I don't want to say complaints, but observations that Saudi has been following the Dubai model for economic development as a competitor really to Dubai, because Saudi has also recognized that perhaps the days of its oil profits are quite numbered now. So that the UAE should feel that there is a little too much regional competition. It's only natural. And again, it's easy for Saudi to say, oh, we should all, just kind of respect each other and be friends. The UAE has a better reason to feel threatened, so to speak.
Well, Saudi Arabia is always going to be the oil world's leading power. No doubt about that. By the virtue of its reserves, its high production levels, and its ability to carry spare capacity, which the other big producers, Russia and the US, don't. So the Saudi Arabia, whether the UAE is in or out of OPEC, is always going to be the big player there. And if you talk about the rest of the economic model, look, Saudi Arabia has every right to try to diversify its economic model. Oil and gas will be important parts of its economy, I'm sure, well out to 2050 and beyond. But of course, Saudi Arabia, even since the 1970s, has been trying to diversify its economy and not move beyond oil, but add to oil, get more value from its oil and gas, and move into other industries as well, as is the UAE and as are other regional countries. So I think there's no problem with that. And I think the competition on the whole is good for the region. We're not expecting that the opportunities of business and finance and tourism and logistics and everything that the UAE is good at is reserved for the UAE solely. This is obviously a business that any country in the region can enter, and overall that kind of competition and there's also complementarities, and we've seen that in the recent conflict, that the Saudi logistics side has been very helpful to the Gulf in terms of providing new logistics routes while the Gulf isn't usable. So I don't think there's so much a problem with that. And I think the UAE feels it has strengths of its own, that Saudi Arabia will find it harder to copy, and the UAE can move ahead at a faster pace in some other areas. So I don't think that's so much an issue.
Okay.
That kind of the side of the rivalry on the energy side and on business generally.
Okay, but then Robin, I mean, quickly, you seem to think Saudi has another good 20 to 30 years of oil and gas prices supporting its economy. But what do you see for the future of oil prices, especially given this crisis now and the efforts of most other countries to find a way to avoid dependency on oil and gas? Is that going to cause greater tension between producers like Saudi and UAE?
Well, in the short term, and I mean, let's say a 1 to 2 year term, obviously depends what happens to the war, but hopefully the war is concluded soon. No guarantee of that. But if it is, there'll be a period of recovery in which oil and gas production is still affected, in which we're trying to refill all of the stocks that were drained over the past few months, and oil prices probably were strong. Beyond that, depends where the global economy is going. But I think, yes, we can anticipate prices will be significantly weaker, probably be more competition in the market, not just from the UAE leaving OPEC, but maybe from Venezuela, from other countries seeking to increase their production as well. And there will be competition for Saudi Arabia, and there will be issues with managing the oil market. Longer term, yes, we talk about the very long term, the 10, 20, 30-year term. Of course, this conflict gives a big impetus to other countries to use less oil and gas, to use more renewable energy, more electric vehicles, and so on. That is a big challenge to the major oil and gas producers. That trend was coming anyway, but absolutely the war, the insecurity, the high prices will certainly accelerate.
Let me ask Giorgio then, because one thing the UAE arguably does have is quite a solid sovereign wealth fund. Does that give it much of an advantage over other players in the Gulf that allows it to seek this pretty much independent path from other Gulf partners?
Yeah, great question. There's absolutely no denying that the UAE is at a stage in its economic diversification path far beyond many other OPEC members. Rather than really looking at the UAE as a petrostate, I think looking at it sort of a global capital machine is the right way to really see how the UAE has become. And this also is a really important factor explaining why the UAE saw it in its own interests to get out of OPEC this month. It's not, it doesn't have an economic model that is so dependent on long-term stability in oil prices, which is the case for Saudi Arabia and other members in OPEC. The UAE, like I said, its economy is significantly diversified beyond oil, and its sovereign wealth funds are so huge. This naturally gave Abu Dhabi reason to view membership in OPEC completely differently.
And Khaled, final thoughts on what Giorgio's analysis there was of the UAE's unique position. Go ahead.
Yeah, people are talking about oil production and prices, but remember, as we talk about, oil prices could even drop sharply in the long term as countries now shifting to renewables, alternative energy to avoid dependence on crude oil and be at the whim and caprice of politicians. So there are other factors that stem in. So it's not just about oil. And as far as Saudi Arabia's dependence on oil, yes, over the past 20, 25 years, there has been a divergence slowly but surely. And only in the last 5, 6 years, we have gone into full brakes, into full gear, sorry. And this is going to happen. But I wouldn't have sleepless nights or any country increasing its production because the major elements of power, land, size, geography, population, do exist here. And, people talk about tourism in some other countries. We don't need even to push for tourism. You get 35 million Muslims from around the globe coming for Hajj and Umrah. So by and large, the revenue stream will keep on coming in.
Okay, Robin, a minute then for your final thoughts.
So I think, we're dealing with two transformational events here, obviously the war and the departure from OPEC, and the war being the more consequential one. And this, I think, is an opportunity for, if anything, for some rethinking on the part of the UAE and on the part of Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf countries. Some parts of their new economic model are working and are resilient and will survive the war and flourish beyond it. And some other parts, definitely need thinking about resilience and how to cope in a more risky and more fragmented world. So I think, overall, this change to leave OPEC does free up some routes for the UAE, but routes that it was really already pursuing and has mapped out for the last 10 years at least.
Robin, that will then have to be the final word for this edition of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists so much for being with us and our viewers for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on social media and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.